Today's video lesson is about the aftermath of World War II and the events that led us into the Cold War. By April of 1945, an end to the war seemed to be in sight. The Soviets were marching on the German capital of Berlin. It seemed that there was going to be peace and stability in Europe once again, but this didn't happen. Of course, we were led into a series of events that got us into the Cold War, a 40-year event that caused great fear and paranoia for many people living in the world. This lesson will highlight some of the important conferences, the people, and the places that were significant in leading the world into the Cold War. On February 4th, 1945, the Allies met in the resort city of Yalta in the Crimean Peninsula. Here, each country had their own agenda for a post-World War II Europe. The United States wanted Soviet support in the Pacific, where they were still battling the Japanese, who had yet not surrendered. The British of course, had suffered major casualties and lost major territories during World War II, and was losing a significant amount of influence in the world. So Winston Churchill, when he arrived there, he was looking to see what he could do to make Britain great again. Joseph Stalin wanted to expand his Communist Party's political sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Many countries, such as Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, were on the eastern side, and they had started to develop communist-style governments. They also discussed an unconditional surrender of Germany and how it would be demilitarized and stripped of its current government and possibly broken up into multiple different countries. On July 17, 1945, the Allies again met at the Potsdam Conference in occupied Germany. By this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died, and Harry S. Truman had become President of the United States. Here he met with new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Truman mentioned to Stalin that he had a weapon to end the war, one that would make Japan surrender unconditionally. He of course was talking about the atomic bomb. Joseph Stalin was intrigued by this weapon and this news, and he wanted the Soviets to develop these weapons so they could expand their influence and compete with the United States globally. On March 5th, 1946, Winston Churchill gave one of his most famous speeches. It was often just referred to as the Iron Curtain speech. And in this speech, he discussed of an Iron Curtain descending upon Europe. And this Iron Curtain was a line that separated East and West. And that line was directly located in Germany, where, of course, the forces of the Soviets and the Americans and the British met to defeat the Nazis. So this speech was really important because it really created this idea in the consciousness of the American people, and for that matter, many people around the world, that there was a competitive nature between the East and the West at this point, and each one vied for influence and power. So this was a major turning point. It was a very famous speech, and I would recommend going onto YouTube and actually listening to some of the excerpts of it. It's a very good speech. The Marshall Plan was another thing that really contributed to very strong tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan was the U.S. government's attempt to give economic aid to those devastated by World War II. So they were able to give supplies and economic aid to the countries in Western Europe, but the Soviet Union would not allow them to give supplies to the countries in Eastern Europe. They didn't want the United States to do this because they didn't want the United States to have any control of these countries' economies. Of course, they were competing for spheres of influence, and this did not go well with the Soviets. So this was really contributed to the tensions. The United States was very angry that they were not allowed to give supplies and economic aid to those countries, and the Soviet Union was very upset with the United States in trying to do so. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine made the Cold War official. The Truman Doctrine was the international policy that the United States would combat any communist force and try and prevent them from spreading their influence around the globe. This international policy created a lot of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. This doctrine created the idea of containment, and containment is the idea that the United States needed to contain the threat of communism. It would use this policy in many future conflicts, especially the Korean War and the Vietnam War. One of the most important events that led to the Cold War was an event known as the Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade was when the Soviet Union cut off supplies and anything else going into the western part of Berlin. This angered the United States and its allies, and so they began to airdrop supplies into western Berlin to allow these citizens to get food, get the help that they needed to live. So this program that the United States and its allies did dropped tons of supplies into western Berlin, and it was tremendously effective. It worked really well, but this really angered the Soviet Union. They did not want them to get the supplies. Eventually, the blockade was stopped, and supplies was able to go into that part of the city. But this really, really contributed to the problems that were about to arrive. So now that you've learned a little bit about the history, the people, the events that led up to the Cold War, I'd like you to team up with a partner, and I would like you to discuss what you think were the two most important things that contributed to the Cold War. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about how we got into the Cold War. Thanks for watching, and tune in next time.